Peace, everyone. This is the Real Talk Podcast, and we're back with another one. I'm sure most of you already know who I am, but for those who don't, I'm your host, Tehran, and joined by my brilliant co host, Roxana. In this episode, we're very pleased to welcome Professor Sean W. Anthony to our show to discuss his article, The Arabs and the Ummah of Muhammad. Professor Anthony's work looks into one of the most fundamental questions in early Islamic history. What exactly was the Ummah of Muhammad, and how did it come to be understood in the first place? Thank you for joining us to discuss your thought-provoking article, which focuses on an aspect of the Prophet Muhammad's mission that I believe is often taken for granted, and that is the very nature of the community he founded. What is meant to belong to the Ummah of Muhammad, both in his lifetime and in the generation that followed. So, again, thank you for joining us to discuss your article.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
All right, and our first question, as with every podcast, because origin stories are just that interesting. What inspired the idea to do a focus study on the significance and semantic evolution of the term Ummah?
Um, so one of the things that I've been playing around with a lot recently is, well, let me put it another way. So whenever you translate or you work with multiple languages, it opens up all sorts of conceptual questions. And one of the things that I'm interested in too is how we not just translate from one language to another, but also from one era to another through like historical description. How do I describe the past in terms that's understandable to someone today and things like that? And oftentimes you wonder if you met someone from the 6th century, the 7th century, the 8th century, how would you explain your world to them, or even your thoughts about their world to them? What words would you use, and what words would not be available to you? And so, one of the things that you start to realize is a lot of the kind of the vernacular and the modern vocabulary that we have for politics, for society, a word like culture, which never appears in the Quran, right? How would I explain an idea of culture to someone from the Hijaz in the 7th century, right? But that thinking about words like that, and when you look at sort of the political vocabulary of English and a lot of European languages, a real decisive moment is the Italian Renaissance, when there's kind of this revisitation of the Greek classics, the Latin classics, the classics of Greco-Roman kind of history. And those classics shape, to a large degree, our political vocabulary. Everybody kind of knows this, words like monarchy, democracy, so on and so forth, constitution. And when I realized that that was really important for my own language, the thought occurred to me like, hey, there's a really large reception history of this sort of political vocabulary in the Arabic language as well in the Abbasid period. What did the reception of this sort of vocabulary look like in the history of the early Arabic Empire, the Umayyads, the Islamic empires, and all this other stuff? And so I started exploring ideas like that, and sort of the low-hanging fruit are things like words like ummah. And so when I really started to ask these questions, and when I looked up, like, okay, we have these great lexicons where you can look up an Arabic word, and you'll get from that information, when you look at the Arabic word, you can see all the Greek words that Arabic word was used to translate. So you can look up a word like ummah and galax. Instead of getting a English translation of it, you'll get basically its translation into Greek, but the Greek translation that you find there is the word that they were trying to use the word ummah to translate a Greek text with in the Abbasid period. And some of the results are very surprising. And they're not the same decisions that are made by modern Arabs, not the same decisions that are made by modern English speakers. And so playing around with that got me interested in all sorts of questions like this. And Ummah to me seemed to be a very kind of important idea in early Islam. And so that's kind of what sparked me on that.
Okay, very interesting. And you begin your article in a very interesting way by drawing a comparison between the religious movement and community founded by John of Tella and that established by the Prophet Muhammad a century later. Could you
Yeah.
explain the parallel and what you hope to achieve by starting your article with this comparison? Because you actually really had me going. I was thinking like, okay, is this another elementary rundown of the movement
Yeah.
of the Prophet for those who might not be too familiar? But then
Yeah.
when I got to the point, and of course this is John of Tella, I was like, okay, wow, this yeah,
Yeah.
it really took me by surprise.
Yeah. So John Attila dies in 538, and he's one of the founders of the Jacobite movement. And they have to create this sort of whole independent church. And they do so on the frontiers of the Roman and the Persian empires. And they have a whole vocabulary of describing what they're doing, what they're about. And one of the things that they call themselves is a polity of believers. And the first time I read this was from an article that I cite of a friend and colleague named Nate Andrade. And I was like, wow, this reminds me a lot of how we describe the founding of the Medinan polity by the Prophet Muhammad. So the parallel kind of came to mind. But one of the reasons why I used it like that is one, we have contemporary accounts of John of Tella's life, even by people who knew him personally, things that we don't have for the Prophet Muhammad, at least not directly. Um, and on the other hand, too, there's just this huge vocabulary that overlaps with how modern historians tend to describe the founding of Muhammad's movement. Now, the difference is if you look up the original accounts of John of Tella's life, the Syriac authors, they do use words like polity. They use the word politeia. They call themselves a polity of believers and things like that. They usually just take the Greek word politeia and they transliterate it into Syriac letters. But you never really have that explicit correspondence between, say, the modern vocabulary and the ancient sources in the Arabic case. So I might call Medina a polity or things like that. I might call it a community of believers. You cannot find that phrase, community of believers, in the earliest Arabic sources, right? So one of the points I'm trying to make is that sometimes when historians describe things in a vernacular that we're very comfortable with in our period, that process can be a little bit, I don't want to say deceptive, but it can be misleading, right? And you can assume that ideas about community, vocabularies of ways of speaking about community existed in that time as well, that there's no anachronism in the language that historians are using. And so I wanted to use the example of John of Tella to show how that process of historical description worked. And hopefully, and also it's like a hook, because it's like, oh, well, this is not Muhammad, it's John of Tella, right?
I did have before Roxana goes on to that, I did have a question if you looked at any other, like another, a comparison that came to my mind
Mhm.
were the Ibad of Al-Hira. Do you
Yeah.
see any similarities with the movement of Muhammad, the John of Tella, maybe that
Mhm.
they're somewhere on that spectrum of creating a community that somewhat transcends ethnicity, kind of doesn't because there's
Yeah.
still an ethnic component to it, or
Uh-huh. Yeah. So one of the things that's a bit odd about Christians and about Christian discourse at that time, we don't use it today, as in like we don't really encounter Christians using it today, and we don't describe Christians in this way anymore. But Christians regard themselves as a new race, which sounds kind of strange to say. Like they regarded themselves as a separate. The word they would use in Greek is ethnos. It would be amme and or ammo in Syriac. Um, they, they would describe themselves in. I don't want to say racial terms because that brings a lot of baggage from our monarchies, but explicit ethnic terms. And one of the things that they regarded as miraculous about their community was that they were a new people, which sounds like a strange claim. So there's this text called the Trophies of Damascus. It's written during the Islamic period. It's a debate between, it's a Christian text. It's supposed to be a debate between Christians and Jews. And one of the arguments that's brought forward by the Christian representative in this debate is, I bet you can't think of any other people, or any other new race or new ethnicity that's ever come into existence except for us. What a strange argument, right? But when you think about how they viewed um, ethnicity in their time period and sort of their kind of ethnographic imagination, they sort of saw most ethnicities as essentially fixed, that originating with Noah and the flood, and also, descended from patriarchs and things like that, some sort of kind of titular founder. And they spread across the earth and things like that. And we're not a time period where new people come about. So that's a long ways to go about saying that oftentimes when the, I say, Ibad of Hira or whatever talk about themselves as Christians or whatever, they tend to be spoken of as sort of the Arabs that are being evangelized or proselytized, as people that are like barbarians or sort of they're outside of civilization, and then say a preacher or whomever comes and integrates them into kind of this new Christian race through like the process of conversion and providing them with like, this civilizing mission. They get law, they get right religion, and they get rid of their vain cults and things like this. This is kind of a typical story of the process of conversion, where the monks or whomever organizes them serves as sort of their lawgiver as well.
You you highlight in your article, you highlight two very broad currents of interpretation
Mm-hmm.
that have developed surrounding the term Ummah in contemporary scholarship. Could you just outline what those currents are and which one has come to be more broadly popular?
Mm-hmm.
And why do you think one model has become the dominant modern understanding of the term Ummah?
Yeah, I think that so there's two broad currents. One of them sees the early Ummah as being a sort of a community that is based upon faith alone, and the criteria of membership only being like a criteria of faith. Like, do you buy into the fact that the Prophet Muhammad is the messenger of God, that the Quran is the word of God that he delivered? Do you, follow the basic five pillars of Islam, that type of stuff? So it's a community of believers. It's a community that is only ideological and doesn't have any genealogical component whatsoever. I think that's the most popular view for multiple reasons. I think Fred Donner's book on Muhammad and the Believers made this very popular from the historical side. But also, this is the way that people tend to use Ummah today. When people say, "Oh, the Ummah of the Prophet Muhammad," or the Ummah of the Muslims, they don't think Arabs or something like this, or they don't think in terms of a genealogical structure or something like this. They think of a multi-ethnic group that is united by a singular confession and religion and its practices. The other view is that the meaning of Ummah changes over time, right? But the earliest use of the word Ummah in the Quran primarily applies to Muhammad's people. One can infer is probably the Arabs. And so the Ummah to whom Muhammad is sent, so Muhammad is sent to an Ummah, and that would be his people, the Arabs. He doesn't create an Ummah per se. If he does create an Ummah, he recreates it, he retransforms it through kind of his mission. But with that view of the idea of Ummah, sees the Ummah primarily as being the Arabs. They're kind of the prestige ethnicity, and they have sort of a divine mission and a divine mandate that they're given by the preaching and the mission of the Prophet Muhammad himself. And so he's a member of that people originally. He's sent to them by God. He elevates them. He gives them a very important divine mission, and it makes them a people of world historical importance. I'm not saying world historical, but of providential importance.
Why do you not find the arguments and evidence presented by the scholars who advocate the more popular view particularly compelling?
Mm-hmm.
And how much is this view, in your opinion, maybe a result of presentist bias?
Hmm. Yeah, I think there is a lot of presentist bias. It's very hard to imagine a word changing over time, especially a word that you like. I'll put it this way. So if you can read Arabic, or even if you can't read Arabic, someone defines the word Ummah for you, and they define it in this very expansive, like global term or whatever. And then you go back and you read the Quran, you say, okay, this is speaking about the Ummah, or you read Hadith, oh, this is speaking about the Ummah, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to use that definition, that kind of working definition that you have, and you're very unlikely to do sort of a historical audit of it. And that applies to just about any word that we use, right? There's a way, for example, democracy today has like an overwhelmingly positive meaning, but in the older senses, it kind of meant mob rule, which doesn't sound very pleasant. So, yeah, I think there is a bit of a presentist bias, but really the crux for me and the thing that led me to dig deeper was looking at how it's used in the Quran in particular. One, if you look at how it's used in the Quran, it has a very wide variety of meanings. And so it's like, what's going on with that? And on the other hand, if you read the Qur'anic corpus, you get a surprising sense. So if the Ummah is something founded by Muhammad, you run into problems with verses that say that Muhammad is sent to an Ummah, and not just Muhammad, but all the prophets in history, right? The model is, if God so wanted, he could have made humanity one ummah. He didn't want it to be that way. So humanity is kind of made up of a bunch of ummahs. And around these ummahs, sort of the scaffolding of providential history is built. And at a certain time, God will send a messenger, a warner, a prophet to each of these ummahs with his message, right? Which is more or less basic and shared amongst all the prophets. And then eventually, in the fullness of time, God decided to send Muhammad to his Ummah. So the Ummah is something that pre-exists Muhammad, and he sent to that Ummah. And so who are these people? Who are these people to whom the Prophet Muhammad is sent? Now, of course, he transforms this Ummah, like I said before, through his preaching and things like this. But the Quran doesn't give a name per se to that Ummah. It doesn't say the Ummah is the Arabs or something like this. But it does say things like the Ummah speaks Arabic. The Prophet is from them and he speaks Arabic as well. It says very explicitly that this is a revelation that was given in Arabic in order to be understandable, to be intelligible to him, so on and so forth. And I definitely accept the objections of those who say that the word Arab or the explicit identification of the Ummah as Arab is not in the Quran is true. But I think that that's being a bit too parsimonious. I think there's too many other pieces of the puzzle that are there. That if you're saying, okay, what is the Ummah of the Prophet Muhammad, they're Arabic speakers and so on and so forth, I think that more or less that means that they're Arabs. And that very quickly follows in the rest of Arabic literature after the Qur'anic corpus. It's very clearly stated. The other aspect I would guess that gives strength to what I feel is the more presentist bias version, where is that the Ummah clearly has a mission that is not just about, say, ethnic exaltation. It's a mission that is profoundly religious in nature, and they're also given, even though they're particular people in a particular time, particular place, they're given a mission through their prophet that has universal significance, right? So people can be a part of that ummah, people can join that ummah, and that ummah can ostensibly expand. And that's not incompatible in any way with the way that we think of tribes or peoples and things like that. You can join one people. You can be one person, you can go to another. The way that it works in our societies is usually you become a citizen of one country, you become a citizen of another. And ostensibly, if someone becomes an American citizen, we're not supposed to say, we ought not to say, oh, like I'm more American than you because like I was born American or something like that. And you definitely do have the tensions in national identities too, where it's like, well, um, we know we were here first or whatever. But these identities are not closed off to other people. People can go in and out. The way that the medieval tradition sort of clinches that and describes it that I found very compelling and useful and that I relied upon was this key distinction between the two Ummas of Muhammad, which are really the same. But it really speaks the transformation that happened. So you have the Ummah al-Da'wah. This is the Ummah that received the summons of the Prophet Muhammad through the revelation of the Quran. That was an Ummah that was not in a good state, disunited, benighted in terms of religion and truth, basically not in a good way. And then you have the other Ummah, which is the Ummah al-Ijaba, or the Ummah that answers the summons, right? Eventually, the Ummah that answers the summons totally eclipses the Ummah al-Da'wah, right? It's something that the Ummah al-Da'wah is more or less extinct. And what we have by the time that the Prophet Muhammad passes away in 632 is this utterly transformed Ummah that's like almost constantly transforming history.
I mean, considering a lot of what you described about the Ummah of Muhammad, especially what it transformed into, how it expanded, how it adopted people, how people could leave. Does that not sound too much like polity? I mean, I understand, as you mentioned before, that this is not what the adherents of the movement or the Prophet Muhammad himself described it as. But is it too far-fetched to describe the movement as a polity, considering all of the features that you just mentioned, even if they didn't describe it themselves? I mean, maybe it's not
Yeah.
too presentist uh,
Yeah.
if the description fits.
Yeah. I definitely think that they had a polity. The question that I would ask is the word for that polity Ummah? And I don't think so. I think the word for that polity in Muhammad's lifetime was Medina, the Medina of the Prophet.
Mm.
So every Ummah or people has a polity, like a way of life. So you have a people that has a name, it's the nation or whatever, and then they have their polity or their way of life. The other word for that is constitution. So you think like we have Americans, right? Americans in all their colors and blah blah blah, and then they have their constitution, their way of life, right? Their ideals that are ostensibly embodied by the Constitution. But the same thing works for the Ummah. So if we want to talk about the polity, do we describe it as the Ummah? No. To me, we would describe the polity as being Medina and the ways of life, the rules governing the communal management of wealth, communal and private cultic worship, essentially all the different ways that you live your life, how you dress, how you marry, how you divorce, how you do your funerals, how you educate your children. You go on down the line. That those are the ways of life that are attached to a people. This is a very common idea that really seems to have emerged with the interaction between Jews and the Hellenistic world, insofar as they began to speak of themselves as a people. They were the Jews, but when they had this idea of what is their constitution, what is their way of life, what is that constituted? Well, that's Torah. That's Torah. That is basically what a prophet gave them as the teachings that are constituted of their way of life as a people. That is their polity.
Mm.
And by the way, that's how Greek politeia is usually translated into Arabic in the Abbasid period, is with the word Medina. Not always. The other way that it's translated is the word sirah, which literally means the way you go about your life, right?
So if the word polity doesn't help us to understand the term in the late antique context, how do early Muslims define the term Ummah? And given the very large gap that exists between those sources and the Quran, can they actually help us to understand how the Quran uses the term?
Mhm. So the way that we get it, so we have a different level of sources. So one of the level of sources that I talk about in the book is they appear more or less from the early Abbasid period. These are people like Al-Jahiz, Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi, who else do I cite? I can't remember. There's somebody I'm forgetting, Al-Farabi. They have this vision of, this broad division of human beings into different peoples. And sort of the way they understand that is that different peoples have different parts of the regions where they come from. They have different languages, they have different customs, they have different ways of dressing. They have all these different manners of distinction. And among those peoples, you have the Arabs, right? And so if you want to get an idea of how that works for somebody like Al-Jahiz, I'd recommend picking up his Mirrors of the Turks. Actually, Robert Hoyland's recently published a nice translation of it.
Gotcha.
And in that kind of book, I don't think I cited it in my paper, but there's this really great scene where it talks about how Ishmael becomes a part of the Arabs or becomes an Arab. And Jahiz actually goes into detail where Ishmael doesn't just start speaking Arabic and he doesn't just like intermarry or anything like that. He literally goes through a somatic physical transformation in his body in order to become Arab. It's like a miraculous transfiguration or something that changes. It's like his inner makeup to be a part of the Arabs. It's really striking. But of course, that's all well and good. Like you said, that's, quite a ways removed from the Quran, even though the Quran is the bedrock of their education and their and how they become acculturated to Arabic and get to know Arabic literature and things like that. They may be reading it as anachronistically as anyone else. If you go one layer earlier, and these are mainly the guys that I was interested in, if you look at the caliphal letters of Umayyad caliphs like Al-Walid ibn Yazid or Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. For them, they tend to use the word ummah and surprisingly narrow terms as being like, yeah, this is the Arabs. And you have to remember that also this is a time, the Umayyad period in particular, in which you have this institution called the patronate or wala, where if you were a non-Arab, and you were going to convert to Islam, then you have to enter into the Ummah, you have to enter into the Arab tribal system through clientage. And so you would literally be attached to a tribe of the post-conquest society or among the conquest elite. And this was a way that you would navigate society. This is a way that you would navigate your life as a Muslim and things like this. And they very much saw people that embraced Islam. This is something that they sometimes welcomed, sometimes didn't, but more or less welcomed. And they saw that as also a process of having to assimilate yourself to being an Arab. Like you would have to dress like an Arab. You have to speak Arabic. And it's one of the reasons why everyone prays in Arabic. And you would essentially have to assimilate to their culture and adopt their mores and their customs, in addition to their religion. And you could never quite actually meet their level either. The fact that you came in as a kind of an outsider as such would always be marked on you and your progeny. I mean, many people, they were often proud of this. You can imagine it if you're, one of the ways I think about it is the way that someone's very proud to work for like a corporation or something that they themselves didn't feel like, oh, I work for Google or I work for Adobe or whatever. Like you're like a client of Adobe. You take proud that you're associated with that, but you don't own Adobe yourself and things like that. So many people were really quite proud over multiple generations to be associated, for example, with the family of Muawiyah or Uthman ibn Affan, or to be descended from someone that converted at the hands of Ali ibn Abi Talib or something like this. This is a matter of great pride. But they would never even, I think, even think to complain like, well, he would never marry me to his daughter. We're like, of course, he wouldn't marry me to his daughter. Who the hell am I? Just like I'm not going to be dating Steve Jobs' daughter anytime soon myself. One, I'm married, I'm in love with my wife, and I'm interested. But let's say my son, no way, he's not going to get it either. I don't think. So there, all that's to say is, I have a feeling that the what we get in the Umayyad letters is different from the Quran, but maybe a little bit closer. But what really happens eventually is you do get a sense where the Ummah has to transcend Arabness, because this Arabness really goes extinct. What supported the tribal structure that helped produce the rise of Islam and the conquest is simultaneously undermined and destroyed by the conquest, especially when the conquests are done not really exclusively by Arabs or Bedouin, but also with the help of people from Khorasan or the help of Berbers from North Africa and on down the line.
But I still found it extremely interesting that in this early period that to be a Muslim was associated with being an Arab, which totally turns on its
Yeah.
head what I thought, the message of Islam was supposed to entail, more
Mhm.
universalistic. But then you
Mhm.
see in the early period that was the case, and you would assume that the earliest we get to the time of Muhammad, those people knew the most. And then
Mhm.
eventually you find out that the whole Arab being associated with Muslim was unattainable. And then
Mhm.
a more universalistic outlook came about afterwards. It's kind of something a bit strange to grapple with a bit.
Mhm.
But are there any pre-Islamic sources such as inscriptions or poetry that might shed light on how the term Ummah was understood in the Quranic milieu?
Yeah. So one of the things that's interesting is a lot of the older scholarship uh, has tried to find pre-Islamic attestations to the use of the word ummah in Arabic. And I kind of revisit those, and I think that they're not very successful. One of them is an occurrence of the word ummah in Safavidic, thanks to my colleague Ahmed Al-Jalad. Discussed that with them. It's like, no, it was a misreading. Ummah was a misreading of the word for scales, actually, like the balance scales, the balance, like Libra. Um, and there's also a couple of occurrences that appear in the diwans of some pre-Islamic poets. There's a lot of problems with that. There's uncertainties about how to read it, things like this. Um, but there can either be imma, umma, and the meaning there seems to mean this idea of having a pact, loyalty, obligation to obey a figure. It's actually very close to deen, but in the very old sense. Deen as in like you owe obedience or you owe kind of deference or kind of have to answer the call to somebody. It's kind of an old sense of piety too. Like have you ever heard the idea of familial piety? You should have a loyalty or fealty to your family, and that you have obligations because of that connection. That's a very old sense of deen too, this kind of binding pact that you have to be connected with either your tribe or someone else.
And
This appears in the
unfortunately, it's starting
Quran.
to become a new understanding of race, or it might
Yeah,
have always been like that. But I can actually see how Ummah used in the pre-Islamic poetry can kind of mean, the same, almost the same meaning as Sunnah, which I
yeah.
can almost see in a semantic range how that can
Mhm.
be linked to, Ummah. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing, so Sunnah is usually, you're talking about it usually is used to translate the Greek nomos, so law. So Sunnah is almost exclusively, but it does have like this broader sense of things one ought to do, things one must, obligations, that sort of stuff. But also models that you follow and things like that. Um, so all of these, so that meaning is that's in the Quran, I argue, and I also argue that a couple other meanings are as well. But what I think that the meaning of the word ummah as an ethnos, as a people, as a nation, I argue that that's a byproduct of the biblicizing influence that comes to bear on the Arabic lexicon. So whether or not that happened during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime or whether or not it happened before is difficult to say. But in the Quran, you have this very rich semantic range in terms of how the word ummah is being used. And what I would argue is that when the word ummah is being used in the Quran, it's being used in a way that late ancient speakers of Greek or Aramaic use words like ethnos, from which English gets its ethnicity. It usually just means nation, people, category of a thing. Or the Aramaic untho, which is very close to ummah, or even ammo, which is also very close. So that means more explicitly nations. It seems to have a very similar semantic range with those. And so that's where you get things like you can have the ummah of the jinn, you can have the ummah of the prophets, you can have the ummah of bees and other animals. The same thing applies to Greek. You can have an ethnos of bees, you can have an ethnos, like you have an ethnos within an ethnos. It can be used as like a generic term for a group, right? So you can even have an ummah within another ummah, within another ummah type of thing. And an ummah can be a category.
Russian doll situation of ummahs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
On this channel, we've discussed with other academics like Dr. Gadazi, who you cited in your article, or Mr. James Howard Johnson, who have both opposing views on the subject, the question of whether the pre-Islamic Quraysh viewed themselves as descendants of Abraham, and whether the or whether the Quran introduced them to the idea, including the idea that the Kaaba in Mecca was originally built by Abraham and Ishmael. Given the evidence that you had to review for your article, where do you personally come down on this in this debate?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to believe that the Quraysh definitely had an idea of themselves as a special people. This phrase that appears in the early literature, Ahlullah, the people of God, seems very important to me and seems to be pre-Islamic. And let me put it this way. So where do they get the idea from? And do we have any reason to believe that they would have accepted the idea of the Kaaba before the Quran as being founded by Abraham or something like that? This is a phenomenon that's pretty easily observable at multiple locations where there's cultic sites in the late ancient world. So you might think, so there's very famous ruins that survive in places like Baalbek in Lebanon or Palmyra in Syria. And you might think that the people that were living near these very impressive ruins and very large temples, sometimes they had churches built inside them, like in Baalbek, knew that these were Roman temples, or they knew that they were Hellenistic temples, or they knew that they had this really ancient history and things like that. It was just known. But surprisingly, that doesn't seem to be the case oftentimes. So we have a number of sources that say that Baalbek was believed to be founded by Solomon. And the same thing applies for Palmyra. And they knew that there was a pagan tension to both Palmyra and Baalbek. They knew that there was pagan worship associated with it, but they saw it as a result of a corruption, right? So Solomon built something beautiful. These pagans, they come along and they ruin it, and then it's restored to monotheistic worship by Christians or whomever. It's a very simple way of. It's not very likely to be correct. I mean, some of them are a bit more, in some cases, a bit more interesting than others. But you can imagine why it would be useful, for example, if Christians wanted to appropriate a temple, and they would say, "Well, why don't we just destroy this beautiful temple because it's an evil pagan temple?" But instead, they decide to build a church inside it. It provides kind of an ideological justification for that. Oh, we're just restoring the temple to its original purposes, right, to the worship of the one God. So there's a lot of examples of that with Abraham as well. The most famous of these is the Oak of Mamre, which in the era of Constantine was supposedly revered by pagans, Jews, Christians alike, because the angels appeared to Abraham there. And eventually it was the site of a festival and a pilgrimage and things like that. And the pagan aspect was shut down, and then it was made into like a Christian site, right? So all that's to say that I think Jews, I think Christians in general, when they looked at the world and they looked at the different places where people worshiped and things like this, they often had a way of viewing the world as the byproduct of sort of benign and benevolent gifts of prophets and holy figures. So they would say, well, probably the reason why this existed is this was a site that was given to them by our father Abraham, and they corrupted it, and maybe one day it will be restored or something like this. You get all sorts of stories like this, and the idea that the Chaldeans, they actually learned all of their knowledge about the stars and stuff from Abraham. Or Aristotle, actually, the reason why Aristotle wrote his books is because Alexander discovered the wisdom of Solomon when he was conquering in the Levant, and he stole it from Solomon, things like this. So what I think is that probably the Jews of Hijaz had an explanation for why the Kaaba existed that probably appealed to Abraham, and that probably drew from their imagination the inhabitants of Arabia as being descended from Ishmael, and the Quraysh being very pragmatic, wanting to have a high status and wanting to kind of come to an accommodation with Jews and Christians, predominantly Jews in my view. Decided to bring it on board. Yeah, of course, sure. Yeah, it goes all the way back to Abraham. It's hard to know in detail. It's a very speculative version of the answer that I gave to you. But I find it at least plausible because it fits in with other phenomena that we see in the period. And we oftentimes do have examples of the objections that are made to the Prophet Muhammad's preaching by his adversaries, Mushrikun of Mecca predominantly. And they never say, oh, we don't believe in Abraham. As a matter of fact, most of the crux of the argument is you're going to make us overturn the religion and the cult of our forefathers that have, an ethical claim on us and that we can't betray. And so the counter argument of the Quran, which is quite brilliant, is rather than revering your anonymous forefathers or ancestors, maybe not anonymous, they're not named in the Quran, you should go back to your original forefather, the oldest of all the forefathers, Abraham and Ishmael, and be loyal to them and have fealty to their kind of cultic project rather than, the ancestors that you're, extolling.
And you're very right. There's no discourse from the opponents in the Quran that suggests that they won't accept that they don't see Abraham as one of their forefathers, and you would think that the Quran would capture that if that was the case.
Maybe I would expect it to, because it has really such a rich amount of kind of back and forth and debate, and of course it doesn't necessarily always represent it accurately. I mean, who knows if it does or not. But I don't think the Quran is just haranguing people. I think that it's trying to create an actual effective rhetorical response to kind of its skeptical audience.
You've already mentioned a couple of instances of the post-Quranic context, the immediate post-Quranic context, which is obviously the early conquests. And in your article, you cite a number of pieces of evidence to demonstrate that the Muslims who participated in those conquests all themselves as distinctly Arab. Can you explain how this evidence led you to the conclusion that this sense of Arabness was not a developmental consequence of the conquest, but rather a premise that guides them? Because some people might say, well, obviously that would entail that would be a result rather than something that would prefigure, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Um, I think for the most part, the evidence that I have, so okay, and then most of the evidence that I would bring to bear has a flaw. That's the pre-Islamic stuff, and the flaw is it's not written by people who necessarily would regard themselves as Arabs, and it's not written predominantly in Arabic. There are some inscriptions that there's an exception for this. There's some early poetry that seems to be an exception for this. But it all has problems of interpretation and things like that. But the, the way that I read most of these sources is that they, in the cumulative, give us plenty of evidence for the idea that this ethnic identity of Arab existed and was embraced by people who are called Arab. We can talk about the Namara inscription. We can talk about Greek inscriptions that refer to the ethnos of the Arabs and its use as self-identification. We can talk about royal titles where people call themselves the kings of the Arabs in the Aramaic and things like this. And we can go on down the line. But one of the things that I would like to emphasize is there are some terms that this historian named Koslip, he calls them asymmetrical counter concepts. And so it's a big mouthful. But what an asymmetrical counter concept is sort of like a label that I would label you with, but you would not necessarily accept yourself. So a great example of this is if I call you a barbarian, or if I call you a pagan, or if you guys call me a Yank or something like that. I would never call myself a Yank, or a lot of times pagans would not. Oh yes, us pagans, or but I know what it means. It's just not my own term. I don't think Arab is not a asymmetrical counter concept. It's not a outsider word. It's a word, as far as I can tell, that is used and picked up without really any hesitation by speakers of the Arabic language. And the idea to me that in late antiquity you would have a language that does not have an ethnos to which it belongs is just weird. It's not something that you have really. Of course
I
we have
didn't think so until I read that part of your article, and I'm like,
yeah.
this actually kind of makes sense because look, I'm somebody who's still on the fence of I'm not like all the way extreme as Peter Webb's 2016 book,
Mhm.
which I still think is a really good
That's
book, by the
brilliant.
way.
It's a brilliant book.
To where like no idea or an Arab ethnos didn't. Well, I don't know. Maybe I am kind of believe. I'm still on the fence on what it exactly meant to be an Arab pre-Islam. I
Yeah.
do believe
Yeah.
that it meant something,
Yeah.
but
Islam definitely transforms it
yeah,
radically.
Islam definitely transforms
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But what it meant prior to that, from my reading, it did mean something.
Mhm.
It doesn't seem like it was exclusively an exonym or a label that was given by outsiders that the insiders didn't accept. There are
Yeah.
plenty of people who tend to call themselves Arabs, but like what you mentioned, when you look at the sources, at least one thing that stood out to me is like the people who identify as Arabs in the sources, which is not many, they have vastly different lifestyles.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so for me, things like that kind of complicates this idea of Arabs being a single people. And then also reading Retsu's book, I mean, I know it came out 2003. We'll be talking about it with him to see how much of it he still holds on to. Even in his book, it seems like he also distinguishes between different Arabs in
Mhm.
different places. So I don't know as much as the experts or yourself, obviously, but in my mind, I'm still trying to come to a conclusion of what exactly it meant to be Arab. prior to Islam. Definitely have an idea of what it meant
Yeah.
after the fact, but
Yeah.
before it's still a bit fuzzy. Even considering having read McDonald's work and
Yeah.
Al-Jalad and a few others, I'm a bit, even when I read Hoyland's work, it seems like he leans to the direction of an Arab ethnicity
Mhm.
prior to Islam, but then at the same time, he's a bit confused about it, using Peter Webb's words to describe
Yeah.
his articulation of it. But yeah, so this aspect of
Yeah.
the debate of pre-Islam and early Islam, Arab origins, identity, and whatnot is a huge question mark for me. So
Yeah. I think it's a question mark for them too. So one of the ideas that I found really helpful, and that I didn't really pursue this line myself until Michael Cooks shared with me a forthcoming article on this subject. Which is gonna come out soon too. Um, and when she made a very interesting point about the importance of Arab as a category in early Islamic law, and some aspects of this seems to go even before the Islamic period. I think the example that I talk about, I cite a couple, but one of the ones that are maybe easiest to understand is this idea of what is Ard al-Arab. So what is the land of the Arabs? Um, and it's not, they didn't have Google Maps. They didn't have, modern maps at all. But so how do they define this idea of the land of the Arabs? Um, and it seems that there was an earlier rule that is not tested in the Quran, but it's carried forth in the conquest, where if you were trading and you were from the lands of the Arabs, the land of the Arabs, then the tax that you would have to pay for trading was lower, and so you would have to pay kind of a um, you have to pay a tariff, I guess, is what the word would be, an Austria, the 10% rate if you came from outside the land of the Arabs and wanted to trade your goods. So it's like a trade protection zone. And so in order to even enforce a rule like that, even very casually, you have to have at least a working definition of uh, who's an Arab and where do they live and all sorts of stuff like that. But even this kind of confusion appears in the stories of the conquest. One of my favorite ones is the story of Khalid al-Walid when he goes to conquer Hira, and he asked them, "I was like, are you guys?" Like he didn't really know what to do with them. He didn't know how to categorize them. He said, "Are you guys Arabized peasants, or are you guys peasantized Arabs?" Like I said, like, are you guys that you're farmers and you have learned Arabic and Arab customs? Are you Arabs that have lost your, Arabness by becoming farmers and things like this? And the response of the guy is like, "Well, I'm speaking with you in Arabic, aren't I?" It's like, so of course I'm an Arab. But he regards them as with suspicion.
mm,
Um, so whether or not like they're true Arabs and things like this. So this sort of thing is famously kind of a problem that has to be kind of sussed out and figured out in different ways, even by the conquerors themselves. As usual, they have a very clear idea of who their core is, but then once you start kind of expanding beyond the core, how people from Hemyar fit in, how people from Oman and East Arabia fit in, who knows, so on and so forth.
and finally, does your understanding of the term Ummah affect how we should think about the Quran's theological universalism? The idea that its message is addressed to all of humanity rather than a specific people? I mean, is it one or the other? Can both exist? From reading your article, it seems I get the picture, and you can correct me that I'm wrong, that you seem to be on board that the idea of Ummah isn't static. It may have
Yeah.
started one way, but obviously, as things develop, transitioned into a broader perspective or encompassing more people.
Yeah. So the way that I would understand it, it's a message uh, from a prophet sent to a particular people that have universal significance, right? There are people with a mission. This is something that's very familiar in all the Aramaic, all the Abrahamic faiths, actually. Um, I think an interesting model that is less universal than the Islamic model is what we get with the way that Jews begin to think of universalism in the Hellenistic period. One of my favorite examples is Philo of Alexandria. So usually the model in the Hellenistic world was each people has like their gods that they have to worship, and they have their cult that they have to remain loyal to. And this is how religious diversity is. And they are required to worship their God and to perform those cults and all other stuff, but no one from outside of their people or their area has to do this, because they're not one of them. They're not Palmyrene, they're not Syrian, they're not whatever, not Egyptian, so on and so forth. And there's also a little bit of, you get bigotry too, like the Greeks make fun of the Egyptians for all the animals in their pantheon and things like this. But in general, that's how it works. And what Philo of Alexandria made a distinction between the Jewish cult and the rest of these cults is he said, whereas everyone else does it for their own people, the Jews, even though they are a chosen people, they're special, they're a people apart, their cult and their worship is on behalf of all humanity, not just on behalf of all humanity, but they're on behalf of the entire cosmos. And so the idea that the Arabs have this special providential role to play, that Muhammad's people have this special role to play, I think is a central part of Islam. And whether or not you take a more maximalist view or a universalist view of what the Ummah is, or if you see it as being originally specific and then later on expanding, like I do, I think you really can't get away from the particularity of Arabness that is present with it all throughout, whether it is through worship, the reading of the Quran, the doing, the performance of prayers, your understanding of what the Sunnah is, and so on and so forth. Arabness is embedded in Islamic law and Islamic kind of ritual performance, and I think there's a reason why that's the case. And different currents of Islam have treated that differently. And I mean, some of them are more maximalist, like all in on the Arabs. This is famously the case for the Hanbali method. And some of them are much more universalist, and more about equality between believers, and you tend to get that. And Shiism, but still at the same time, you have this exalted status of Ahlul Bayt and so on and so forth. So it's a negotiation, I think, for most currents of Islam still.
Yeah, I would agree that Arabness is, as I've heard some classical Islamic scholar quote, is the raw material for Islam. But I
Mhm.
often wonder if that's just a consequence of Ismailite identity kind of riding off the
Mhm.
back of Arab identity, because it's kind of hard
Mhm.
to disassociate one from the other. And I
Yeah, yeah.
wonder if we're kind of, I mean, just to push back a bit, I just wonder if your article is kind of, mixing the two, that
Mhm. Yeah.
what you're mistaking for the Ummah intended, or the who Muhammad was intended to be sent to, the Ummah being Arabs, is
Yeah.
actually like what Gaddarzi leans towards, of Ishmaelite identity being central to that.
Yeah.
And as I've already said, Arabness just kind of as a consequence of who the Ishmaelites became. Yeah, so not to waffle on
Yeah,
too
that's a
much.
good point. I know that's a good point. It's a good pushback because it's not Arabs as such. It's the descendants of Ishmael. It is descendants of Ishmael and Abraham, right? And so the idea that their peoplehood has to be rooted in Abraham, I think, is very important. It's Yeah, I think that more or less is where this idea comes from. I think one of the things to be emphasized too is that um, there's a lot of influence of biblical ideas on the importance of Arabs in general and their chosenness, or Ishmaelites or whatever. Um, and one of the key things is there's scene in the book of Genesis where the angel clearly tells Hagar that she's going to make a great nation out of Ishmael.
Mm.
And then it lists the 12 princes of Ishmael and things like this. Um, and it's I to me it's only natural that once kind of the biblical imagination becomes embedded in sort of the ethnographic understanding of the late antique world, that people look at the Arabs as people of biblical providential importance. And we do some examples of this in late ancient authors. One of them that sticks out to my mind is Theodoret of Cyrus, where he says, you know, look at the Arabs in our society now. These were not the Arabs of the Hejaz, these were the Arabs of the Syrian steppe and the Roman province of Arabia. So look how numerous they are, look how they're flourishing. This is surely a fulfillment of the promise that God gave to Abraham, that he would make his son Ishmael into a great nation. So the idea is it's not a very large step, right? That, oh, God made them into a great nation. Well, maybe he has a providential plan for them. Maybe there's a special thing he's going to do with them since he made them into this great nation. It's not a extremely large step. It seems to me that Islam takes that step.
No, I would agree with that.
Just an aside from that, and your answer reminds me of a question that has plagued me for quite a while, so I thought I would pick your brain. Do you have any opinion about why the narrative of Hagar is completely absent from the Quran?
Yeah, interesting. I don't really have an opinion about that. She shows up extremely early on later. And she's definitely in a lot of early hadith. It is very odd, isn't it? I think part of the issue is that really no woman is named in the Quran except for Maryam. I think that's correct. I mean, she's of course not the only female figure in the entirety of the Quran, but I think everyone is nameless besides her. I can't think of anybody else off the top of my head. And so I think it might be in conformity with that in general, but she, unlike Sarah does appear in stories of Abraham, things like that. She doesn't really appear. There is a old trope, and I don't think this explains her absence in the Quran, but there is an old trope about the Arabs hiding their descent from Hagar because they were ashamed. They were ashamed to be descended from an enslaved woman. And so this is usually attached to the name Saracen, which is introduced by the Romans. And they give a false etymology that Saracen means descended from Sarah. And it was a way of pretending that they were descended from a free woman rather than a slave woman, Hagar. And there is this kind of funny, goofy anecdote that I always remember about Hajjaj, this early made governor of Iraq, where he boasts. He says, "I'm a golden man." And it's like, "You're a golden man." He says, "Well, I look at my genealogy, I don't have a single slave in it when I look back until I get to Hagar." And then this pious man, he was reposting. He's like, "What kind of boast is this?" He's like, "If it wasn't for Hagar, you'd be nothing but another dog in the desert. Right? You would be nothing without Hagar." So if there was an embarrassment about Hagar, it very quickly disappeared. It was not a major prominent feature of early Muslim piety or anything like that. So I just mentioned it because it is a trope that is attested in late ancient literature.
Okay. On that note, if Roxana doesn't have any more questions, I don't. And thank you for answering all of our questions. It was a very thought-provoking article. It touches on some central topics or from guests that we've hosted on in previous podcasts. So it was only fitting to invite you on, and we were looking for something to invite you on about anyway.
Ages, yeah.
So but
apologize about my dog, by the way, misbehaving. I'm home alone, so I don't have my usual helpers to keep them at bay.
No, it's okay. It's usually my kids that I got to try to keep at bay. So I definitely understand where you're coming from. But is there anything else that you're working on or expecting to come out with? The book that you came out with some years ago, it's still running laps. I still see people quoting it online, purchasing it or reading it. But is there anything else that you're coming out with?
I guess my most recent thing is a translation I did with Stephen Shoemaker an eyewitness account of the conquest of Jerusalem in 614 by the Persians. So the conquest of Jerusalem happened right before the Arab conquest of Jerusalem. And I have a bunch of other articles out that are and ones that are coming out too. The next book will probably be the translation. I have a new edition translation of an early biography of the Umayyad Caliph Umar ibn Abdulaziz. I need to finish writing the introduction to that, so you can look forward to that, I guess. I think it's a very interesting biography. It's the first biography we have of anyone in Arabic other than the Prophet Muhammad.
Okay.
And Umar ibn Abdulaziz is a kind of a very idiosyncratic and interesting ruler among the Umayyads as well. So,
Yeah, for him to only have ruled for 2 years, he had a really big impact.
exactly. I mean, he may have been poisoned. That might be. I mean, there's all sorts of rumors about why. I mean, there's poison rumors about every single ruler.
Yeah, you're right about that.
Yeah, but he was massively influential despite his very short reign. So,
Okay. Well, on that note, again, thank you for being a guest on our podcast, and we actually hope to bring you on again for something else.
yeah, maybe so. All right. Thanks again, guys.